Welcome to the Learning Curve with Kenny, the podcast where we explore strategies, mindsets, and best practices to elevate learning and development. I'm your host, Kenny, and today we're diving into a powerful concept that's reshaping how knowledge is shared in experienced organizations, peer-to-peer learning. If you're looking for fresh ways to unlock the collective intelligence within your teams, you want to stick around for this one. Okay, joining us today is Charles Thiede, CEO and co-founder of Thiede, a platform that empowers expert communities to share insights, connect, and learn from one another. Charles brings a unique perspective on how peer-to-peer learning can be harnessed as a strategic advantage in the digital age. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kenny. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you, and thanks for taking time out of your calendar to make this possible. I'm really excited on this topic. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of this thing, I like to kick things off with an icebreaker, or what I call a learning moment, a quick learning moment. So what's something new that you've learned recently that really stuck with you?
I thought about this, and I've been taking, I don't know if you know masterclasses.com, some classes there. So online learning through famous people mostly. And
Okay.
I was listening to Steve Martin, who's a famous comedian and writer. He's on Saturday
The Steve
Night Live.
Martin?
Yeah, the Steve Martin. I think he did short snippet. And one thing I really liked about what he was saying about storytelling, he's working on a play. And he was talking about, a lot of people that are working on a story or whatever you're working on, everything's stories, right? So you're always kind of wondering what should happen next, or what will happen next, right? And so his view is, instead of thinking about what will happen, or I don't know what will happen, it's what should happen next. So the question is, and then the story will create itself from there. And Eckhart Tolle, I don't know if you know, the German teacher, philosopher guy, he also says, I don't mind what happens next, which I also like. So it opens up the creative juices doing that.
Okay, that's a really good start to the podcast, I must say. I'll have to listen to this one again to take personal notes.
Yeah,
because it's so much fun, sharing the experiences and talking about diverse topics. As today we are talking about peer-to-peer learning. So and I always try to take something with me. So Charles, a lot of people, well, let me put it this way. A lot of the L&D efforts still rely heavily on top-down learning. So why do you think that these approaches often fall short in today's dynamic digital-first environment?
I think they don't necessarily fall short to hit some kind of key goals and outcomes, in the sense that it's a tried and true approach, but I think there's gaps in the sense that people learn from their peers. They learn from dynamic conversations. They learn from conversations like this. And they also learn from the wider network. And so I think if it's just a one-to-many kind of pedagogical kind of viewpoint to take people through a learning journey, without those conversations, without that network, and without sort of dynamic, unstructured learning from the bottom up, I think those two things could blend together really well. And we've seen it blend together really well. So the learning becomes more dimensional in that way.
Okay, that's in the podcast I've learned, talking through, to other experts like you, that there seems, the biggest takeaway I always have is that there's no one way to learn. So the more ways and tools you have to apply learning, the higher the chance of reaching those individuals that want to learn. So peer-to-peer learning taps into something that I would consider deeply human, which you've already alluded to, which is learning through conversation, experience sharing, and collaboration. Why do you think this approach is a strong fit for the challenges in organizations, or the challenges that organizations are facing right now?
Well, so I think people want to engage, right? And they want to connect with their peers. They want to learn, but they also want to give back. I think that's a huge part of, and something that we don't
Ah,
really talk about enough is the need to give back, for whatever the motivation is.
mhm.
So I think that kind of collective sharing is really important. So I would say that, having access to people to answer questions is amazing. But if you're going through a process and you're learning, but the context that you have is complex.
Mhm.
So talking to the right person at the right time and at the right moment. So you might read an article or take a course or go to an event, and that's a great way to learn. But it's sort of intellectual learning. It's not necessarily in context learning. So if you have a real problem at that moment that you want to solve, if you can tap into a network of your peers or
Mhm.
true experts, then you can get those contextual things solved very quickly. And I think that's where kind of learning, the structured learning is great, but then in context, we got to solve problems on the fly in the moment. And that's why the peer-to-peer networks, I think, really help solve problems for people, and then they can share and give back. So it becomes a kind of a virtuous circle as well.
Okay, fantastic. You've introduced one new topic that I definitely hadn't thought of in learning, but looking back, I guess it completely makes sense. Is when you said that uh, those peers want to give back something, and um, I'm probably pretty sure that you probably had some elementary school teacher or something back in your time where this giving is a large portion of the teaching part. And it's interesting that we've now also you've taken that and also kind of put it in a digital format, so to say. Um, Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Okay, um, let's move to like some practical applications. For the L&D listeners out there today, what are some of the practical steps that they can take to start integrated peer-to-peer learning into their, or start integrating peer-to-peer learnings into their programs?
So I think the best the best way to start is to start with the cohorts,
Hmm.
to shape cohorts of individuals that are focusing on a topic.
Hmm.
And that can be aligned to a course, or it can be aligned to a new topic that could be dynamically created. So starting with small groups as opposed to large groups. And then as the small groups start to develop and there's sort of interdisciplinary networking, then the community starts to grow. So I would say start with small micro communities, micro
Hmm.
networks, and get them talking, get them sharing, and then kind of copy and paste 10 times. And then you can start to derive collective intelligence from the accumulation of those cohorts. So that's one way, I think. And learning is typically structured based on a topic, and that topic could be anything from quantum computing to drug discovery, whatever it is.
Hmm.
That's a journey, but in the journey, create space for new things to pop up. And I think the other thing is to use the cohorts for code development. So, what topics do they want to add to the course? Do they want to teach part of the course? Do they want to contribute to the course itself? So I think there's a lot of ways to leverage the cohorts that probably already exist in different pockets within an organization and get them together and co-developing the content and the learning itself.
Okay. Okay. Sounds fascinating. Um, Although, uh, could you dive a little bit more, since I'm not that familiar with the topic? Um, could you explain the topic of cohorts a little bit more?
Yeah, these are groups of people. So a cohort might be, a group of, it could be students in the
Hmm.
professional setting. So it's just another fancy way of saying groups.
Oh,
Groups of peers. Yeah, but they're typically Sorry,
Oh yeah,
structured
no,
and
I
brought
stepped into
together
that one.
to they're brought
Okay,
together to so you might have a cohort in academia that's working on um like a topic to or a research paper or things like that.
okay, okay. So what the layman would call a group, and in your case, then in a scientific setting, a cohort. Then,
Yeah.
oh boy, testing my vocabulary today too. Okay, so but the fundamental thing, or one of the other challenges, of course, is that um, the peer learning only works when people are willing to share what they know. Um, how
Correct.
can L&D professionals encourage knowledge sharing behaviors?
Well, that is a challenge because you have to create a space of trust,
Hmm.
and so it has to be a place where people feel comfortable sharing. They're encouraged to share, and so typically the best way to start is to start with what we call the friendlies. So, find people like Kenny that want to share knowledge on, podcasting and how AI is leveraged by Riverside or whatever.
Hmm.
So it's going to the friendlies and just, getting people out there that you trust and also can represent your brand or your department or whatever. Start with them, and then from there they can nominate people, and it can actually expand based on the friendlies in the beginning. It takes some risks. I think a lot of people are concerned about people complaining on a community, or it so rarely happens in a professional B2B setting. It
Hmm.
just doesn't typically become a challenge. People want to put their best foot forward and kind of showcase their expertise. And I think that lies where that's kind of where the crux of it is, where people want to showcase their expertise to the world.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and I think that's a really important incentive. So get those people incentivized by giving back, kind of going back to what we were talking about.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. So you're kind of putting this into a really nice bow there. Um, Although I'm getting a little bit of feedback, I think. Can you hear the feedback on the
No,
line?
no,
Okay. Um, okay. So we've kind of described some um, practical ways to get the program started, how to encourage people, but we also there's a high digital factor here. So
right.
digitalization is the thing. So what role do digital tools play in making peer-to-peer learning scalable, trackable, and aligned with business goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm just going to go back to something you said, Kenny, which is people learn in different ways. Everybody,
Hmm.
I learn probably visually and kinesthetically. I'm not an uh, audio learner, if that's a
Hmm.
term. Um, and I like to learn in micro chunks. So that's why the master classes are great for me. I'll just dip in, dip out. And so I think it's developing tools that move along that spectrum. So digital tools that some people just love to learn from their peers by having a conversation like this. So have the tool to facilitate that. Other people love to read content that's highly structured. So create a tool for that. Other people love to learn through video conversations, and obviously others just want to go through a course and learn that way and get their certificate. So I think it's kind of understanding the spectrum, and so we think in terms of different behaviors, and so there's kind of what we would say is a researcher. So that's somebody that's just researching a topic. They're learning by research. Then there's a learner, and that's somebody that's actively learning. And then there's going to be a contributor. So that's going to be somebody that is contributing content or to a conversation, and they learn by actually doing that. And then the final one is really around collaboration. So when you're starting to collaborate, so I think it's just building. We have different modules and building modules around that spectrum, and then letting the LMS players own the deep kind of structured learning, which is obviously a really popular way of learning as well.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and actually it gives me something nice to add on to that topic, because I think you did a really good way of explaining, what digital formats or tools we can have, and the interesting thing is, in a roundabout way, I had a previous podcast, which was a little bit marketing focused, and one of the things that came out of that was basically getting to know your audience. And I thought you placed that very well, because you said, you first had to categorize. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. So it's interesting to see how this all ties in and how, things are kind of universally applied.
Right.
Okay. So we talked about how to get there, but of course, one of the things that you always, there will always be challenges and pitfalls or possible misconceptions, like my misconception on the cohort thing. So let me ask you this: while peer learning sounds intuitive, it's not always easy to implement. So, what are some of the common pitfalls organizations should watch out for while trying to roll this out?
I think, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if we go back to our kind of university days, the peer-to-peer learning, typically, students they're kind of novices in what they're learning, but they do learn together. And I think, where I saw it work as when I was a kid was really around just very small groups, having conversations about very specific topics. And I think in business where things potentially fall down is that we're not really replicating that model. So I think having spaces where you get a small group of people talking about a very specific topic towards hopefully an outcome. But there doesn't have to be an outcome. I think where people struggle is where they create a very broad topic. So they think that their topic is going to be enough. If, let's say it's in, procurement or data science. Those are very broad topics. So it's getting small groups of people talking about a very specific problem statement where they actually want to change the status quo. So it's not just about, let's have a chat about, data science in a quantum world or whatever. I just made that up, but what problem are we trying to solve in that space to change the status quo? So I think, small is a great way to shape that. So micro networks, I would say. So bringing that kind of university approach into business in a learning environment, I think is the way forward, where you have these small groups. I can't remember what we called them, but you have these workshop groups where we would come together, and there might be a TA, teacher assistant, that's like facilitating that, but lets those people then go off and learn together.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that ties in with what you said at the beginning, is the creation of small cohorts, and there then you see the pitfall that basically people start too big and grand. Okay.
Can I add to that, Kenny? Sorry.
Sure.
Really quickly, I think also expecting it to happen by itself in the beginning. You need to facilitate those conversations in the beginning. Until you get to kind of a critical mass where people are starting to do it for you. So in the beginning, it might take 6 months, it might take a year of just facilitation. And then after that, it's like, it's a little bit more hands-off, but there's still kind of somebody that's nurturing those spaces.
Okay, that's a whole new perspective on getting the ball rolling. That sounds like a continuous and long effort then, and like I said, you're speaking from experience. So, interesting point then here. Maybe one of the takeaways is don't expect it to happen from one day to the next.
Yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But the return on investment is going to be tenfold if you put in the effort in the beginning.
Okay. You got to stick with it though.
You
Okay.
got to stick with it.
So another maybe misconception or thing that might be, how should I say this, might be introduced is the question of, should peer-to-peer learning replace structured training, or is it more of a complement? And if so, if it's a compliment, how do you find the right balance? I think the last part of the first two questions, I think we pretty much already answered throughout the conversation, but I would still encourage you to answer it. But I think the focus would probably be on the second part, on how finding the right balance.
Yeah, I think one doesn't trump the other. So I think that it really depends on the environment, the dynamics. It might be a place where, an expert network, peer-to-peer learning environment will have some structured courses, but they're there to collaborate, right? So they're not there to necessarily go through a learning journey. They're there to collaborate and produce a deliverable into that network. They're still learning, right? So that's still a learning process, but the journey is not to go through a course. On the flip side, the requirement might be to go through a course to get an accreditation, or to, get your HR, your security, kind of learning covered off as part of the employment contract, right? You're not going to necessarily build a cohort around that, right? So you're not going to take a group and say, hey, let's talk about these HR policies as a group, right? So it really depends on the context. I think they blend together. Just like I also think it's part of a wider circle. So I think you're learning, you will have face-to-face events, and then you have your network, your peer-to-peer community, and those three things working together can be a really nice blend of creating great brand awareness, and also getting people to collaborate towards hopefully changing the status quo, changing the outcomes. So I was just going to say, like right now in an uncertain world, this is where peer-to-peer communities, peer-to-peer networks are really important, right? So, but sorry, I'm about to go off on a tangent there. But it depends.
You're welcome to go off on the tangent, because
it depends on the context, Kenny. I think it depends on the situation, definitely, where they complement each other or one trumps the other.
Okay. This reminds me of one of those expressions. I'm going to dig into one of those really old, true and tried expressions. You need the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we try to encourage with the podcast, and with this podcast in particular, is to expand your toolkit, to look at other tools, to see what's out there, and see how you can apply those. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway in all this. We have so many fantastic tools, but in some cases, some of them might not, really be well known. I've had a podcast on peer-to-peer learning in a different setting. Listening to peer-to-peer learning, I thought it was a very kind of exclusive, but talking to you, it's not a niche product anymore, so to say, or a niche form of learning. Rather, through you, it's found a larger market to apply to, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. This kind of is a perfect segue to the next part that I was actually going to ask, and that's future outlook. So as we look to the future, how do you see peer-to-peer learning shaping the next generation of L&D strategies?
I knew this question was coming, but it is a big question. I mean, we we have a place where people are gonna want answers through, an AI interface. And I think how does that affect the L&D approach, right? So,
Mhm.
so I think there's gonna be, obviously, as you're going through a structured course, and maybe in a learning management system, you might have questions, right? And so those questions might be answered by some Gen AI tool, I think.
Mhm.
And I think that's also limited. I think you still need to have access to people, and have people helping you go through that process. So, I- you know, I, I think the future might be more of a blended approach between kind of a highly structured learning journeys, an AI kind of interface to help you go through that, and then having access to real humans in real time. Because I think human intelligence is we're forgetting about it, but I think it's really important, and it's going to be derived by having access to people at your fingertips. So having experts. So I could go through a learning journey, and then and I think as the world gets more and more complex, I need to know, like, if I'm applying that learning journey, it's not going to be kind of driven from a survey. I think it's about getting back together with people and having conversations, having discussions, and then also producing um, follow-up content and potential dynamic learning approaches. So I think that's going to be an interesting change. I think the structured learning is potentially going to flip on its head. I don't know,
Mhm.
but I think the peer-to-peer, having access to humans, is going to be actually more important right now.
Okay. I would tend to agree. I think with I hear that a lot through other channels too. Is basically AI is great. Fundamentally, everybody's saying AI is great, but don't forget the human element.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said about human interactivity. Something that so far I would say AI has not been able to completely match. Um, uh, Everything from body language to other interactions that you have with individuals. Um, so we'll see where that future goes.
Yeah.
But
I think it's
I
it's
would,
really hard for anybody to pinpoint exactly where it's ending up. We're all kind of on this roller coaster right now,
Mhm.
and so I think people are going to be surprised about, particularly in our space, particularly in your space, like where learning is going to take form, of what's going to change. But the learning journey through a structured course is such a tried and trusted approach, and it just works. So I don't see it breaking down, but I definitely think it's going to be blended between an AI interface and peer to peer.
Okay, most definitely. I'm looking forward to that to see
Yeah,
to see
see that in 5 years.
what. Yeah, we'll have to get back on to get on the
Yeah,
topic in 4 years, and then we'll see where we land on that. Um, so another point though, um, in this section of like closing thoughts and final thoughts, um, wh- what are the other challenges that I see for the L&D leaders that are trying to foster a more connected and collaborative learning environment? Is that you also have to create like a shift of mindset or create practical habits that you can create from that. So is there something that you could recommend that one could start today for those learning professionals out there? So what would be like a shift of mindset to get to these collaborative learning environments?
I think one, take risks, by bringing people together and having those conversations.
Mm.
Know where it can work, where there's something that people really want to collaborate on from the learning. So it really comes down to the objective of the learning. So, I think just as an example, let's say you're a very large customer service department, and
Mhm.
you need to onboard, 100 people, every year, and then you have a turnover of 20% of those people. How do you create a space where they're learning, but also can tap into building knowledge, on the fly, so that they can also take what they're learning dynamically and apply it to the knowledge base, to the collective intelligence, so that then when you have more onboarding happening, you have people that have been around for a couple of years adding to the knowledge base, to the community. So in that example, I think it's seeing learning as one pathway for onboarding, for learning, for getting people up and running and doing their jobs well, but then helping each other do their jobs better through what they're learning in the day-to-day. And that's where I think those two paths can kind of connect.
Okay, fantastic. That sounds absolutely great. Okay, final one.
Okay.
Which I put under the category of call to action, so to say. For those folks who want to explore peer-to-peer learning more in depth, are there any resources, communities that you recommend that they check out?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a great deal of them, to be honest. That like teaching. So there's like places like Community Roundtable and Community Pros. There's a few spaces that talk about developing communities.
Mhm.
So I would say it's kind of an underserved space. Obviously, you can come to our knowledge base and learn through us. But I would say it's in a development phase where there's not a place where I would just highly recommend a community is really teaching about communities, which I know it's quite a bit meta and a little bit incongruent. But
Mhm.
I think the best place to start is to learn from the people that have done it professionally. So
Mhm.
the people that have developed communities. So learn from the peers as well on that topic.
Okay, or like you said,
Yeah.
take a look at Zapnito. I mean that's also certainly a way to have a look and experience it firsthand how it is in a digital environment, because I think that's where you are absolutely smashing it, is by creating this digital environment for everybody to check out. Okay, so
Thank you.
Charles, that wraps up today's episode of The Learning Curve with me, Kenny. Thank you
Thanks,
very
Kim.
much
Thank you.
for sharing your wisdom and perspective on the power of peer-to-peer learning. And to you, the listeners out there, if you found today's episode valuable, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe, or just send us a review, and or even better, share it with somebody else in your L&D network. So until next time, always remember to keep learning and keep growing.
Thanks, Kim.
The Learning Curve with Kenny is presented to you by Share IMC, one of the leading providers of digital learning solutions. Make sure not to miss any of our seasonal content by subscribing in the podcast app of your choice.